when you're making decisions, and that makes decisions very difficult. And so LCA is a way to help you structure doing that. And there's lots of ways to react to that as well. So the policies that you can set, individual lifestyle changes, individual companies making changes, and that kind of thing. So understanding where best to make changes, I think, is also a way to use the tool. And so going through that. But a lot of times as well, there are companies that have adopted life cycle assessment, and what they found is that just bringing the people into the room that are sort of expert in different areas within the company and have them talk through a project really helps them to understand the process better. And once they put on paper the full life cycle impacts associated with the process, sometimes a lot of inefficiencies will jump out that are sort of, when you think about them, they're actually very simple and straightforward, but they didn't identify them until they actually laid everything out on paper. And so Suncor is an example of a company that actually uses life cycle assessment a lot. They use it for individual decisions that get made on a daily basis, so which pump to use, which type of technology to go forward with at a small individual incremental level, as well as at the very high level when they're looking at new projects to develop. Right, and in that sort of setting, they identify the people in the room the people that should be in the room to have the conversation, and a lot of times those people have never met each other before, right? So the pipeline guy doesn't meet the refinery guy, doesn't meet the extraction guy until you get them all into the room, and they start talking through the process. And somebody that is focused on extraction, a lot of times doesn't understand what the refining implications of the products are. And so actually getting them in the room, they start talking through and they can find a lot of synergies and potential inefficiencies that they could correct through the process. And that happens a lot. There's a lot of examples of that. The other way that life cycle assessment sort of comes in, and the oil sands companies are ones that I've been working with for the last 5 years, is that understanding the life cycle methods, they can actually help to inform their stance on different policies. And so we were engaged quite a bit when California announced the low carbon fuel standard, and sort of helped the companies think through what the implications were, and that helped to inform their decision about what sort of public stance they were going to take on these types of policies. And then the last thing is just that it can be used for marketing purposes as well. So somebody can come out, and this happens a lot more in Europe because LCA is much more embedded in the culture in Europe. But then people can make claims that our product is 20% lower on a life cycle basis and things like that, and that can be used appropriately and inappropriately, and there's lots of examples of both of those. So the basic steps of doing a life cycle assessment, you do the goal and scope definition, and this could apply to most projects, right? So you set out and you find out what you want to do and how you're going to do it. You do an inventory analysis where you actually go out and collect all the data and build your model, run your model, get your results back. The impact assessment is where you actually translate your inputs and outputs, so you conduct these big mass and energy balances. So you have your estimates of how much energy and how much material you're going to be consuming and how much you're emitting to the atmosphere. Once you have that, though, you can't normally take that to anyone that's not an engineer or very well versed in environmental impacts and that kind of thing, because 2 tons of sulfur dioxide is not something that most people can take and do something with, right? They can't envision what does 2 tons of sulfur dioxide look like, what does that do to the environment? And so the impact assessment is where you actually translate those 2 tons of sulfur dioxide emissions into air quality issues and acid rain and all of the other things that actually affect the environment from the emission of those products. The interpretation sort of goes on throughout. This is an iterative process. Interpretation is actually saying, okay, well, we're going to expect that the pH of the rain in this area is going to be decreasing by a certain amount, and then you sort of interpret that in terms of the other sources of sulfur dioxide, this is contributing, say, 10% to this local community or something like that. So you try to actually interpret the results and actually translate them into something that somebody who's actually making the decision will actually be able to use. There's guidelines, as I said, they try to formalize these processes. I'm not going to get into that, but it's a way to try and standardize the process to give you more direction on how you can actually conduct these life cycle assessments. But it's never going to be to the point where somebody can say, okay, I followed all these guidelines, so now we can put a stamp that no one can challenge these results, right? You're always going to be able to challenge them. You're always going to be able to look at different ways, different assumptions, and things like that. I'm going to skip through some of this stuff just to get to the sort of model that is the typical way to do life cycle assessment, as I said, is that you have a product that you're looking at producing. And you can look at each of the individual processes that are required to actually produce that product. So if you're looking at producing a vehicle, Then you can look at all the different pieces that are required to actually put this in. So the paint, the rubber, the metal, all the different components. So you can actually look at that. So if one of these components is steel, then you can actually go through and say, okay, for the steel that I require, what are all the processes that have had to happen upstream associated with that steel? So then you can go back and look at the energy inputs associated with extracting and processing the ore to turn it into the steel product that was consumed at the automobile manufacturing facility. And then you can say, well, but one of those steps was the actual energy that went in, so the electricity that I required. So then you can go back and say, okay, well, where did that electricity come from? And there was a whole process associated with that. And you can very quickly get yourself muddled into so much detail that you just don't know what to do with yourself and you don't know where to end this, right? And that's one of the big problems with life cycle assessment as well, is that it's called the boundary, right? At some point you have to cut it off and say, you know what, the pens on the desks of the people that work at the power plant are probably not going to have a huge environmental impact, so I'm not going to include that in my study, right? And there's some things that are going to be really obvious that are going to be easy to cut out. But the rest of it, a lot of times people use their gut feel. I don't think that, you know, the plastics are going to be as important as the steel, so I won't look at that. Right, and that's fine if you have, you know, a long experience and that you sort of, your gut is well informed. But a lot of times that can get you into trouble, because what happens is that some of these upstream factors, you don't necessarily have them in front of mind, right? Because a lot of times what you think about are the tangible things that you see in front of you. And you sort of don't think about all the things that are upstream that could potentially have additional consequences. The other issue is that the services associated with producing this stuff, you know, when you're looking at all the things that might be important, the legal services associated with actually producing that electricity probably wouldn't be top of mind in terms of the biggest contributors to environmental impact, right? And that's true, that is a small fraction. But the cumulative effect of all the services associated with this can actually add up. And so, you know, ideally you would go and try to be as thorough as possible and do all of this, but in reality you usually get assigned a task where you have 2 months to complete something. And you need to make decisions about how much data you have, how much time, and how much money you have to get the data that you need. And so that is one of the issues associated with it as well. There are some tools available that allow you to do this. And so things that where they've collected data that might be applicable to your system, that you don't have to go out and collect it yourself. You can use a software tool to do that. I can leave these slides in case anyone wants them, because I'm going through them pretty quickly. This is a whole laundry list of the criticisms associated with that, but I think one of the biggest things is that, you know, sort of the boundary issue, the data you use, all of that is going to be important. The last thing I'll say about it, though, is the dynamics of the system as well. And so I was trying to think of examples of things that would be appropriate to use life cycle assessment and others that aren't. And so one of the things that came to my mind is the Keystone Pipeline, which all of you have heard of the Keystone Pipeline? Yes. It's hard to be in Alberta and not know about the Keystone Pipeline, right? And so this idea of deciding whether or not to go forward with this pipeline from Alberta to the southern U.S. We've done a lot of life cycle assessment of oil sands, and so we've got the full mapping of the issues and the trade-offs associated with different infrastructure. So we can come back and show you what the implications of actually building this pipeline are and things like that. And that's great. We need life cycle assessment to help us understand those things. But when it comes to informing the Obama administration about whether or not to approve this, there's so many other issues involved in this, right? So it is, what would you do if you didn't have the Keystone, right? If you're informing Premier Redford, that's one thing, about alternative ways to get